Just starting the stream. Not sure whether you guys can hear this because the lights of the stream lights are changing from orange to red, back to orange, and then green again. So I don't know whether this is. I don't know whether this is working. I know that YouTube has been down a lot recently, but hey, it looks like I'm here. So hello and welcome to this rather nervous How to Code Well live coding class. I say nervous because this is probably the toughest thing that I've taught live on the YouTube channel. This opens the gates for so many other super complicated stuff that I can do live with Jenkins. But today we're going to do a Jenkins, Docker, and PHP tutorial completely live, which means that it will probably go wrong halfway through, but we'll work that out. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to use Docker to install Jenkins, and then after I've installed Jenkins in Docker, I'm then going to use Jenkins to pull down a PHP website that I've created. I've actually created that for one of my courses that I've done for Manning Publications. I'm going to pull that down. It's a Docker image, and then we're going to inspect that in the Docker build. So basically, it's like a whole build process where I'm building Jenkins via Docker, and then Jenkins is then building a PHP web server. So that's the plan. Gosh, I really don't think this is going to go too smoothly. But anyway, I've got copious amounts of Earl Grey and a drink of juice. So, cheers. Here's to it working full time. I very much doubt that'll happen. Jenkins is one of those weird things. It's kind of like whenever you build it, you kind of need to do a little bit of trial and error just to work out all the cranks. And in fact, what I'm going to be doing is breaking it on purpose just to show you what the error messages are and how to get around that, because there's no point in me just building something from start to finish where it's all just working and pristine, because life isn't like that when we're programming. We face bugs and issues all of the time, so be prepared for issues. I'm just going to double check a couple of things before I dive right in. I'm just going to check that I've got... No, I don't have that. That's great. The image of the PHP site. Bear with me just a second. There we go. Okay, right, I'm just going to copy that into my notes. I knew there was something I forgot to do. I've had such a busy day because, just being a freelance developer and everything. What I did last week, I think it was last week, is I did a poll on whether or not I should be doing this Jenkins tutorial or other tutorials regarding Docker. I did a poll on Twitter, and I did a poll on the community tab here, and the community tab chose Jenkins as the next tutorial. So this is what I'm doing with Twitter. I think it was MySQL that was winning, but there was not as many votes, so therefore here we are. We're running Jenkins today. So let's get cracking in. You can tell I'm just kind of skirting around the edges a little bit. Let's crack on. If you've got any questions, do put them in the comments below. I'll try and keep half an eye on the comment stream, and then I can get to them at the end or during, depending on not how this thing goes. So the first thing I'm going to show you is the setup, and it is completely and utterly blank. We just have a folder that says Jenkins-howtocodewell.git. There is 0 in there. We have the terminal window here, so I can now do docker ps-a. You can see there is nothing at all in here. We are going to create a Docker machine, and that Docker machine will have obviously its own IP address because we're using VirtualBox as the driver, and that will have the Jenkins running off of that, and then we can do some bits and pieces with the ports. I'm also going to be using Docker Compose as a way of building this thing and running it and tearing it down and so on and so forth. I assume that you've already taken a look at my Docker tutorials, both Docker container tutorials, Docker machine tutorials that are here on the channel. If you haven't done so already, please do go ahead and take a look at those, because I'm going to be skipping over a whole bunch of stuff. Plus, I have a Docker in Motion course from Manning Publication, which goes into so much depth with Docker. It's about 5.5 hours worth of Docker. Lots of examples and tests that you can test your own knowledge with, and you'll build the website that we're going to be dealing with or building from Jenkins in this tutorial. So there are going to be things that I'm just going to skip over because I've assumed that you've seen those tutorials, but if you haven't done so, do check that out. I do appreciate that I am literally just going to dive straight in here. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a Docker Compose file. Excuse me. So I'm just going to right click and do new file. We're just going to have Docker, whoops, it would be helpful if I typed into that, docker-compose.yaml. And in here, we're just going to have the version, and we're going to set that to be version 3 of Docker Compose. That's fine. Let's just bring out that a little bit. Excellent. So the next thing, we're going to create the services. And this, well, we're only going to have one service at the moment, and that is Jenkins. Whoops, like so. And we are going to build that from a Docker file. So we're going to do build. We're going to put in the context of the current working directory. That's fine. And so that means we need to have a Docker file. Whoops. And we won't worry too much about the ports yet, or the environment variables, or the volumes, but I'll get onto all of that soon. The next thing we need to do then is create our Docker file. So we're just going to do a new file, and we're just going to type Docker file, like so. And I guess at this stage I should say there is many ways to install Jenkins in Docker. This is the way I've done it before. It's worked before, but I have used so many different variants. So for example, for anyone who doesn't know what Jenkins is, it's a build server. It's an automatic build server that can listen to various different triggers. So for example, if you were to commit something to a particular branch in a Git repository, then it would listen to that, or there would be a webhook that would fire from that, and it would cause a Jenkins task to run, and that task, or job as they call it, would build whatever you've defined. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to have a defined job that will create or pull down a Docker image from the Docker Hub, and then run some commands against that Docker container once that container is spun up. But you can use this into so many different ways. For example, you could use this to run tests. This could be a pipeline, so you could do a whole build staging deployment if you wish. And also with Jenkins, there are various ways of installing Jenkins itself, and actually splitting Jenkins up between different projects. So for example, you could have a Jenkins as a master, and you could have several slaves. Why would you do that? Well, perhaps, for example, you want to have something that is running on some particular hardware. So for example, if you were an iOS developer, you would need to use Xcode. Not all of your projects may require that. So for example, if you were a mobile app developer, you could be deploying, or building, I should say, Android to one slave and iOS into another. You could do various other things as well. If, for example, one slave didn't have much resource, then you could do lighter stuff on that and so forth. That's where the complexity is, because with Jenkins, where you have different slaves, you're basically having different levels of configuration for each of those slaves. And with Docker, and you've got to appreciate that the idea of master and slave for Jenkins was so pioneering before the Docker container stuff. With Docker containers, it's slightly different because you are literally spinning up containers, which could themselves be, I guess, Jenkins slaves. And that's kind of the approach that we're going to be tackling today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to type from and then Jenkins. Whoops. Let's just copy that in, otherwise I'll get it all wrong. So Jenkins, and we're going to be using the LTS tag. LTS stands for long-term support. Long-term support basically means that, well, it supported long-term, right? So that's what it means. Okay, so we can save that, and if we ran that, we would download Jenkins. So just by having those few lines in our composer file and the Docker file, we can therefore build our Jenkins image for Docker. It doesn't build the deal with the container. It doesn't do anything with volumes or anything. I'll get to that in just a second. I'm just going to put a space in between those two. But that's kind of the first stage. The first stage is just running a container or a service, I should say, from the current build context, which is the Docker file, and we're literally just doing Jenkins and LTS. I guess what I could do at this point is I could just run this and just see that this does work. I'm just going to do a ls just to make sure that I am in the right working directory. That's fine. Let's now just do a Docker compose, and then let's do a build, and that will hopefully build Jenkins from LTS. That's fine, and away it goes. So it's downloading a load of stuff. I appreciate with this live stream I'm having to download an awful lot of bits and pieces, so this might be a little bit choppy from time to time, but hopefully it'll run through. I mean, it's running off of the first layer at the moment. The rest are all waiting. Oh no, it's done several layers. That's fine. Good. I just want to check a couple of things, make sure that the stream is still looking good. Excellent. Okay. So just waiting for all of this to download. There's quite a few, as you can see, all of these layers that are having to be pulled down just for this. It's quite a few actually. But once this is pulled, as I've mentioned in the Docker in Motion course that I did for Manning publication, these layers will then become cached. In fact, what I've forgotten to do, let's just clear this. What I've forgotten to do is I should have created a Docker machine first, because this is just running off of the default, and I don't want to do that. So let's just take a couple of steps back first, before I get into any of that in any more depth. Let's just create a README file. I think what I'll do is I'll put all of this in Git after this stream. So let's start from scratch. All right. So the first thing we need to do is well, I'm just going to do Docker plus Jenkins, and we're just going to have requirements. And the requirements, I'm going to have, let's just clear this down. Well, we need to have Docker machine -v. I'm just going to paste that in. We need to have Docker, compose -v. I do apologize. I should have done this a long time ago in the stream. Otherwise, I'm going to get people asking me what versions of things. So these are the versions that I'm currently running, and you can see on the right hand side this is the markdown that I'm running. We also need to have VirtualBox, and I don't know what version of VirtualBox I have, but I'll find that out later. So don't worry about that. Let's now run some install guides. So let's do install guide, and I'm just going to bring that back to be a H2 rather than a H1 or a title. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is we need to create. We'll clear that down, the Docker machine. So I'm going to do Docker machine, and we're just going to create Jenkins hyphen how to code well. Okay, so that will download the boot to Docker and all the other bits and pieces. I'm just going to copy that, and I'm going to type in here install Docker machine, and I'll explain why I'm doing this in just a second. So I think in order to put in code, there we go, we can do 1, 2, 3, 2, 3 like that. There we go. So the reason why I want to have a Docker machine is that each machine will obviously have its own IP, and what I need to do, because Jenkins is a website essentially, I need to have a way of viewing that website. So I need to have an IP, and what I can do is alter my host entries to point the IP of the Docker machine to that website, which I will be doing later in just a second. So we got to wait for this to run. I do apologize. I should have done this beforehand. If I hadn't have done this live, I would have edited all of that out and started again. But this is the thing when you're doing things live, and like I said, this is actually an extremely complicated thing to teach, because there's so many different moving parts. It's not just Docker; it's Jenkins, and then of course there's the PHP stuff after that. So we're installing Docker machine, and that machine is called Jenkins how to code well. So here it's going through the motions, creating the SSH keys, starting the VM. And of course, if you don't know what Docker machine is and how to use Docker machine, then do check out the Docker machine course that I have. I did that a while back, but it still is relevant. All the bits and pieces that I was teaching in that about how to switch machines, how to create machines, how to remove machines, how to interact with different machines, it's all the same. So anyway, we've now got to this part here. So what I'm going to do is do a Docker -machine env, and what did I call it? Jenkins how to code well. Okay, so that now gets me the environment variables, and if I ran this eval, that should put me into that machine, or it shouldn't put me into that machine, I shouldn't say that. It evaluates the environment variables that are set to the current shell. So I'm going to just put in configure shell, which is that. Okay, so that's step one out the way. So that's creating the Docker machine. Next one we're going to do is we're going to deal with the Docker compose file, which we've got up here. So now we're in here, and if I did docker ps-a, we can see that there's nothing here. And if we did docker images, that should also be blank. Images, if I can spell it. Images. E-S, there we go. That is also blank. So if I did a ls, we can now run the docker compose build. That's what I'm looking for, build. And that should now build Jenkins against this Docker machine. The previous build I was doing was actually doing it against the default, which I'm going to have to clear up after this live stream. So I do apologize. I should have done that all before. So once this is done, once we've built this, it means that we wouldn't necessarily need to build all of these layers again, because we've got this downloaded. And also, it means that we can do all sorts of things and inject all sorts of bits and pieces into our Docker container once the container has been created. So we're just going to do a simple build at the moment, and we're just going to wait for all of that to go through. Hopefully it won't take so long. So I suppose what I could say, I'm a bit tired right now, and the reason why is because last night I was up until about 1 a.m. Deciding which conferences I wanted to go to next year, with the small amount of change I had. So I'm a little bit tired, but I've managed to book a conference in a far off land, which I'm pretty chuffed with. I won't say what, not yet, just in case anything happens, because it is some time away. But it's a PHP conference, and I will, if it does happen, if I do go, I will definitely be talking about it through this video, and obviously through the podcast as well. And I'll be talking about the talks that I've seen. And it got me thinking the other night. I've been doing a couple of user groups. I spoke a couple of times at some user groups this year, which was great, and I definitely want to continue doing that. But I think I would really like to speak at a conference, and it's a terrifying thought to do that. But I think I'm going to put it on record that by the end of this year, I'm going to have at least one call for paper out. No, let's make it 3 CFPs written and out. And I don't think any of those would ever go through, but I've created some CFPs, or I've gone through the motion on I think it's papercool.io, I think it was. And I've actually filled all of that out, but I got to the submit button and I got terrified and decided against it. But I think it's something that I would like to do, or at least try out. It's certainly completely out of my comfort zone. And I think that as a developer, you need to look for things that are outside of your comfort zone to do, because that's the way that you learn. And like this channel, for example, I've learnt a lot of stuff via the questions that people have thrown to me, because I've wanted to know what the answers are. Most of the answers, I didn't know, and therefore I needed to look that up and then teach that, which has been fantastic. So it's a two-way street. So this channel has actually helped me progress in my development journey, and I also think that the next sort of stage is more of a speaking type affair, which I'm pretty digging. But anyway, going back to this, it is now built and it has been tagged. So if we did Docker images, we should be able to see that. Let me just double check that you can actually see that. Yeah, you can see that on the screen. That's fine. Okay, so we have the LTS, and we've also got our own image, which is fine. So now we can actually go ahead and do some bits and pieces against it. We can bring up the container if we wished, but let's just go back to this Docker Compose file and take a look at what things we need to inject into Jenkins to make it work and work fairly well. The first thing is that with Jenkins, there are a certain number of ports that you need to keep open. One is obviously port 80, and then the other, excuse me, is port 5000, because Jenkins does some bits and pieces in the background. Also, I believe that is the port for the slaves to communicate. This can all be configured, of course, through Jenkins itself. But what we're going to do is we're going to set up the ports now. So in this part, we're just going to do ports. And I'm going to have the first port is port 80. And we're going to go to port 8080. Second port, we're going to have, well, if we were to use this as HTTPS, then you would, of course, have 433, or sorry, 443, I should say. But we don't necessarily need to do that today. That's fine. But we certainly need to have port 5000 and port 5000 like so. Let me just double check a couple of things. Or 50,000, I should have said, not 5,000. Oh dear. It's been one of those days, really. So that should be fine, because we're not worrying about HTTPS yet. That was, I think, another choice on that poll. I could have done Let's Encrypt. That's a good one to teach. So anyway, after this, we need to deal with some other volumes. So we're going to type in volumes. And the first volume is going to be the Jenkins home. Now this Jenkins is Jenkins _home. This is actually, a folder that we need to create. So Jenkins home, and that's going to go to var Jenkins. If I can get that, if I can see the keyboard, Jenkins home, like so. So again, this as always, this is the source, this is destination. I'll just double check that that's all kosher, which it is. Of course, I need to have the dot, otherwise that's going to be in the root. So we need to have a folder. We need to call that Jenkins _home. Again, what I didn't do first of all is I didn't have the dot here. This basically forces that into the current working directory. So we're going to have Jenkins home. The next thing we're going to do is, well, there's a couple of more volumes that we need to have, but we're not going to worry too much with that just yet. But one thing I should say is that we really need to have a gitignore file. Whoops. If I can spell ignore, there we go. And this gitignore file needs to ignore everything from in Jenkins home, because you don't want to be committing all of this stuff that is in Jenkins home, and Jenkins home is the home of the builds. So for every build, you create a folder, or Jenkins creates a folder in Jenkins home for that particular build. There is, I think, a build per build, and then there is a build for the last stable, the last failed, and so on and so forth. So you really don't want to be putting all of this stuff in Git. And also, of course, there's going to be, there could be a number of security things that you don't want to have in Git either. So that's worth mentioning, that you know, the security side of these build servers. If someone was to get into your build server, then they would know everything that you're building, and of course your build server needs to have certain credentials to do certain things. So it might be communicating with production, for example. The build server itself is actually an extremely sensitive thing, so you need to be very aware of what you're putting into what you're putting into this. But I'll commit all of this later. This isn't, don't worry too much at the moment. Okay, so going back to our Docker Compose file, we have Jenkins, we have the build, we have the context, that's fine. We've set up the ports. We've got the volumes in here, so this is Jenkins _home, which is that folder that I've literally just created. I guess what we could do is we could have a .git keep, and so we just have a folder in here, and that means that we can do Jenkins, and we could do Jenkins underscore home, and then dot git keep. This means this basically means that it's going to ignore this file. Now, the reason why I did this, of course, is that when you commit a empty directory into Git, it doesn't actually do anything with it. So there may be projects that you've got that require a folder in your project, and the contents of that folder needs to be hidden, but you need to have that folder regardless. A way of doing that is by having a git keep file in here. I'm just a little bit curious as to why I wasn't getting any auto completes on that, but we'll persevere. I think that's okay. I've probably put a spelling issue in somewhere, but anyway, let's go back here. Let's run this. So let's do a docker ps -a. There is no containers whatsoever, and if we did a docker compose up -d, so we were doing it in detached mode, we should be able to bring up a container. If I did docker ps -a, we should now have that container. Now, I apologize that the way that this is all sort of messy. We've got the ports over here, and we've got all sorts of, the name here and everything. It's just because there's so much stuff on the screen. I do apologize, but that's just basically that single container that has ran, which is fine. Which means that we should be able to communicate with it. What I'm going to do off screen is, because I haven't set it up yet, is let's just, I might be able to do it here. Let's do docker. I need to get the IP of this machine. I believe it's 192.168.99.101, but I just want to be sure. So docker machine active to get the active machine, which is Jenkins how to code well, and then docker machine -machine IP getting Jenkins how to code well. Oh, it's 102. Fine. Okay, that's no problem. So I'm going to just quickly do a sudo of etc. I believe it's hosts. Putting in my password. Oops, no. Sudo nano, moron, or vi for vim. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create another, what did I call that? 192, I should have put that in the notes, 192.168.99, I think it was 102. And we're going to give the host the name of Jenkins.local, which means that if I type Jenkins.local into my browser, hopefully it's going to go to 192.168.99.102, and it's going to go on port 80, which will ping it to port 8080. So hopefully, fingers crossed, that will be fine. So let's just quit this. And what I need to do is I need to just go into my notes. Sorry. There we go. There is this fancy command that I need to run. Oops. If I can paste it. I can't paste it in there. What? Copy. Paste. No, that's really annoying. I may have to type this out. So anyway, there's this fancy command that I need to run, which will basically refresh the hosts. Why can't I run that? Sudo kill all. This is where it's not going to work because I've got a type error. Hyphen capital H U P MDNS and then spawn. I'll put all this in the Git stuff. Sponder. Now, this you only have to worry about this for Mac. I'm working on an iMac at the moment. Hopefully that will sudo kill all -m-dns. If I could spell, it would be dangerous. There we go. Okay, so that hopefully now has refreshed the hosts, which means that if I go over to the browser, I should hopefully be able to access Jenkins. Hopefully, if I go to the Jenkins site, let's just do jenkins.local. Is it going to work? Something's working. I'm just going to go to, oh, of course, the I need to change this, don't I? So let's go over to the browser here. That's what I'm looking at. That's what I'm looking at. And let's just bring that down. Whoops, not that. Bring this down, and then I'll show you the address. If I bring that up, so you can see jenkins.local, that is the address that I'm playing with. Let's bring that down, bring that back up. Okay, so let's just knock this back a little bit so you can see what's going on. What does that look like in the stream? Yeah, that's okay. Okay, so that's fine. Now it's saying that there is a secret in initial admin admin password. It is a text file in var Jenkins home secrets. Now, notice if we go back to the old code, which is that button there. Notice Jenkins home is now full up of stuff. We have the config files, and we also have our war file or folder, and in there is our warstone.jar. So Jenkins is a Java application. Just in case you didn't know. And we also have our jobs, so that's going to be the builds that we're running. We also have secrets. So I could, if I wanted to, I could go through this Jenkins folder here, Jenkins home folder, and actually find that. So I could go to var Jenkins home, which we are in, and then it's secrets, and then it's that secret here, which is initial admin password. So I could, if I wanted to, look at that and then paste this into here, into the browser, into that. But because we are going to pretend that we need to be able to do this. If this was in a Git repository, we need to be able to do all of this without having access to all of this stuff. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to do docker ps. Let's just bring that back so you can actually see what I'm doing. Docker ps -a. That's the name of the container. So we can do docker exec -it to go in interactively into that container, and I believe we have the bash shell, hopefully. Yes, we do. And I can now do a cat of this. It's not letting me copy anything in, is it? So var Jenkins home, and I could do secrets like so, and it's initial admin password, which is exactly the same. I'm just going to copy that whole thing in. So that's how you would do it if you didn't have access to the actual physical files. You would go into the container itself and you would pull that out through perhaps cat or nano or whatever you wish to use. I would just use cat, to be honest. So we would copy that, go into the browser here and paste it in. Then press enter. Not now. Right. So now we have the option of choosing between installing selected plugins or to select plugins. So suggested plugins or to select plugins. I'm just going to do suggested plugins. So it's going to go off and do its thing. I've just noticed in the stream here, it's a little bit cramped. I'm just going to bring down, make it a little bit more obvious as to what's going on. Let's bring that up. There we go. Now you can see it. So it's running through the motions. Is there a way I can get that? Yeah, that'll do. And you can see here all the scripts that are running, or all the things that it's installing and all the things that it's doing. So it's dealing with the SSH credentials, pipelines, and so on and so forth. And there's various. These are all plugins, and so there's quite a lot of plugins to deal with. So so it might take a little bit of time. But so far, so good, eh? You know, so far, so good. But we certainly haven't got to the hardest part. The hardest part is getting Jenkins, which is in Docker, to install or to build another Docker application. That is the hardest thing. This setup stuff certainly isn't the most difficult part of this process. Once this is running, once this is done, we won't have to do this again. However, when it comes to dealing with applications and builds and projects and stuff like that, you have to adapt your Jenkins job to match the requirements of your project. And if you've been doing web development for some time, you'll know that every project is completely different in terms of configuration and all of that. So the difficult part of Jenkins is actually getting the Jenkins builds or jobs to work. That, like I said, is very trial and error. So we'll just wait for this to run. This is probably going to be my last live stream this year, 2018. And I must say that this is probably the hardest live stream in terms of just general complexity that I've done. So I'm kind of ending it on a high, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so it's done the mailer. It's working through the matrix authorization strategy stuff, downloading all the bits and pieces. This is all being downloaded into the Jenkins home, into the Jenkins home folder, which means, again, we won't have to do this again. And there are certain things in the Jenkins home folder that you might wish to commit. So, for example, I've got a build of Jenkins which is similar to this, I guess. I've got that running on my Mac Mini. I have it running on my laptop. I have it running on my iMac here. And they are all serving from the same Git repository. So, or they're getting all the configuration from the same Git repository. So for example, if I wanted to alter something, if I was to go and see a client, because I'm a freelance developer, if I wanted to go and see a client and they needed to have another build, another project to work on, or just some extra test or something to do with the automated process, then I could alter that here on my laptop at the client's office, commit that, and then when I get home to this office, I could then do a git pull, bring that back, and the build will mimic what I did on the laptop, which is good. Although you have to be very, very careful as to what the things you are committing, because of course there are a lot of sensitive information in the Jenkins home, as I have just discussed. So we need to create our first admin user. I'm just going to call it Peter with the password of test. I'm just going to bring that down. Let's not, no, lowercase p. Thank you. Okay, confirm password. I'm just going to run test. Full name is just Peter. Email address is foo@bar. .com. This is just for testing purposes, right? So don't worry too much about that. Let's save and continue. Yep, that's fine. And it's picked up the URL that we're running off of, which is jenkins.local. Again, you could, if you wished, use the IP that you had on your Docker machine. However, usually I have about 5 or 6 Docker machines running. Well, 3, 4, 6 probably maximum running at any one time. Although it depends, if I'm working on something in the swarm, then there is more. But anyway, so the IPs aren't fantastic to put in because IPs change quite frequently, depending on whether or not you've got your Docker machines all up, or if you've got some up, they might take the IPs of the other ones. I prefer to use host names. I prefer to use verbose labels of things, and then I just tweak the host, the etc host file, to point to wherever the IP is. So I don't like hard coding IP addresses into the configuration of these applications. If I can get away with it and just use like a host name like this, then more the better. So let's just save and finish. And it says that Jenkins is ready. Let's go ahead and start using it. And here we go. This is the Jenkins dashboard. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to play around with the stream just to make it a little bit more user friendly, because it doesn't normally look like this all in one sort of stretched layer. That's probably better. There we go. Let's bring that out a little bit more. Excellent. Wonderful. Okay, so this is how Jenkins looks. And if I was to go back into the code, like so, and if I was to exit Jenkins, so exit the container, go docker ps-a, I can quickly tear this down. I can do docker rm-f, so forcibly remove it. There we go, it's down. If I did docker ps-a again, there's nothing there. And if I refresh the page, it would just fail and fall on its face. However, because I've got everything running off of in Jenkins Home, the next time I spin up the box, it will find all the bits and pieces it needs. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go back into the browser. I'm going to refresh the page, and it's just going to hang because it can't find it. Eventually, the browser will say that the site can't exist, or doesn't exist, or what have you. It can't be reached. But if I was to spin the box up again, so if I go back into the code, if I did docker, what was it, docker compose up-d, and then went back to the browser, refresh the page, go on the right browser, that would help. Refresh the page, it will eventually come back to life, but it will ask me to log in again. But it won't obviously ask me to log in using the details that I first put in, the initial admin password. It should just ask me the password of the user that I have created. So this is kind of my way of showing you that using these Docker bind-mounted volumes, so here you can see that it's getting to work, it's restarting, it's reloading. Basically what we did there is a complete hard reset of Jenkins. Jenkins was running, but we completely teared down the container. This is now going to bring back the Jenkins welcome page, and I can put in my username, which is Peter, and the password of test. I can sign in, and hopefully it will bring us back to that landing page, the dashboard. So we'll just wait for that to refresh. Yes. Okay, so that's kind of that's the installation part of that done. The next thing we're going to be dealing with is actually building something. So to do that, you would click New Item, and we're just going to do test, for example. I mean, whatever, and it's a freestyle project. I will probably do a Jenkins tutorial at some point where I talk about all of this stuff in more depth. For now, though, I just want to get to the point where we're actually building something in Jenkins. So I've just created a test example. Just gonna check the stream. You can't see that. Let's bring that up a bit. There we go. So you can see the save button. Okay, so this is the first build that we're going to do, and we're just going to discard all of these options. We don't need them at the moment. We're going to go right to the bottom. We're not going to worry about the source code management because we're going to do this manually for now. We're going to scroll all the way to the bottom to build. So we're going to add a build step. We're going to execute a shell, and in this instance, we're going to actually call upon Docker to do some bits and pieces. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to run, just for test, Docker info. Because what I'm going to do let's go back to the code for a minute. If I did Docker info here, we get this lovely printout of all the information regarding Docker on this system. And that, to me, proves that Docker is working or running. So what we need to do is get the same thing running on Jenkins. So I'm going to go back to the browser here. So we're just going to execute the command of Docker info. Now, I know this is going to fail, and it's going to fail badly. But I'll explain how we can actually get Docker in Jenkins as we go, because this is starting to get to the complicated parts. So let's hit save. Let's now build this, and it's completely and utterly failed. So you can see the build history. If I did the console output, we can see that it's failed because Docker is not found. Now, the reason why we want to use Docker is we want to pull down a Docker image and then run the application within that image and do some testing against that container. That's why we want to use Docker in Jenkins. It's actually technically Docker in Docker because Jenkins is in Docker. And you've got to be very careful with this. There are other ways you can do this. You could use various different plugins and so on and so forth. But for now, we're just going to install Docker within this container. And we're going to share the host Docker binary and socket to this container. That might sound a little bit like nuts, but that's how we're going to do it in this instance. Like I said right at the start of this tutorial, there are many ways of doing this. This is just one way of doing it. So what we need to do is somehow access Docker within our Jenkins Docker container. Okay, right, so to do that, let's go back to the code and let's take a look first of all at the Docker file itself. Well, the first thing we need to do is we actually need to install Docker. So I'm just going to copy the Docker file that I have in my notes into here, and then I'll explain what it does. So let's just paste it in. Okay, so we have user root. That is the user that Jenkins is running against. No. Jenkins runs against the user Jenkins. But what we need to do is change that to be the user of root, because we need to go ahead and actually install Docker. So this is what we're doing here. So this is the first run instruction, where we're doing an apt-get update to update the sources, and then we're doing an install. We're installing certificates, curl, software properties, and so on and so forth. We're then curling, we're running a curl to download docker.com, or Docker itself from docker.com, and then we're adding the keys. After that, we're doing an add apt repository to add that to the repo. Then after that, we're doing an update, because we need to do an update after we've actually added that to the sources. And then we are doing a install of Docker CE 17.12.1. It's probably that's quite old. We can probably up that if we wanted to. And then what we're doing is we're running user mod, and we're giving the user Jenkins access to Docker itself. So that's the first thing we need to do. The second thing we need to do is we need to actually share the socket between the host machine and the container. So the host machine in this case is the Docker machine that I created earlier. So we can do that if we clicked on docker compose.yaml. We can do that by sharing the file through perhaps a volume. The first one we're going to do is this one. This is the passing through var run sock, docker sock from the host machine, and we're putting that into, or we're linking that to that destination, the same destination, but on the container. Okay, so this is host or source, and this is the destination. After that, we also need to access the binary as well, which is debatable because we've downloaded it. But anyway, so we have bin docker in there, which means that hopefully, if I save this and if I did a docker compose and then a build, it's going to build Jenkins. So it's not going to download the Jenkins image because we've already got that, the LTS, but it's going to run those new commands that we had in the Docker file, which in this case is the apt-get and all of that stuff. So hopefully that will run smoothly. So at this point, it's just, well, it's down here. It's doing the apt-get update, and then it's installing Docker CE from the sources that we've downloaded up here. Now, I'm pretty sure there's going to be people out there who are pulling their hair out and going, why on earth are you doing it like this? Because perhaps Docker is now into this, in these repos or what have you, or if there's other ways of doing it, then please let me know. I've certainly done all sorts of different ways and configuration over my time. The thing is, being a freelance developer, everybody's setups are completely and utterly different. And so sometimes you have to do things that aren't necessarily the best way of doing them because other people are doing them. Yes, you do have the ability to say that you shouldn't be doing it like this, but sometimes when things are so ingrained, you just have to go with it. This, in my opinion, is the easiest way of running Docker in a build command, by sharing the host Docker socket. But again, you've got to be extremely careful, because any command that you run against your build in Jenkins is basically sharing the socket against the host. This is why I like doing all of this stuff in a Docker machine, because you're isolating that to a degree. Usually I have Jenkins just sat on a box somewhere, and there's not a lot else on that box that's working. But Docker machine is basically what a lot of people don't use Docker machine, and I struggle with not using Docker machine, because there are so many different projects that I work on, that it's just an easier way of splitting things out. The thing is, if you pile on all of your containers into one Docker machine, then you're opening yourself up to security issues and other complexities. You know, how many times have I seen developers pull their hair out because a certain port is being taken over by a container that isn't currently in use at the moment? But anyway, this has now successfully built. And if I did a Docker PS, I think this is it down? No, it's still up. But I still need to do a Docker -compose up-d because I need to recreate this container. Fine, excellent. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just go back to the browser, like so. And I'm going to go back to the project. This should refresh itself, hopefully. Fingers crossed. I didn't actually check the status of that container. Excellent. Okay, so that's always a good thing to see. Please wait whilst Jenkins is getting ready to work. So it means I haven't broken anything, which is good. Okay, so I'm just going to put in the credentials again for my user. And of course, we can still see that we have the build that was failed. That's fine. But if I now ran the build again, come on, I did click that, honest. There we go. It actually passed. So if I hold that and go to console.log, or console output, we have Docker info, and it's running. It says that it's got one container, and that is because it's Jenkins. It's got 7 images, fine. And all the bits and pieces that you would expect from Docker info. Now, this means that we can do all sorts of things in Jenkins with Docker, which means if I scroll to the top here and go back to the project, hit configure, we can start doing some fancy stuff. So bear with me whilst that refreshes. Come on. Don't crash now. Okay, scroll down to the bottom where we've got Docker info. What I would like to do is I'm going to pull down the image. Let's just go back to, let's just bring this up a minute. Oops. So let's have a look. Bear with me a minute. Bear with me just a second whilst I go to the Docker Hub, just get the right bits and pieces. Okay, I think I've got them. Okay, so if we did a Docker pull of this web server, Manning Web Server 01, this is the image that I created, or we created if you were doing the Docker in Motion course from Manning Publications. This is now going to do a Docker pull to pull down that image. And then what we're going to do after that is we're going to do a Docker run. Although we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's just pull that down first. So let's save that. And then let's hit build. And we are on 3. Let's go to the console output. So here we're actually pulling a Docker image through a Jenkins build, which is pretty cool. So we'll just wait for that to run as it goes down. So this is the Manning Web Server 01 that I did in the Docker in Motion course. In that course, there was like 5.5 hours or so of content where I was teaching Docker from the ground up, basically, talking about the Docker layers, talking about how to secure it, the good practices of Docker, and so on and so forth. I'll leave links to all of this, to that course in the show notes. It is an extremely in-depth course, so if you are learning Docker, then do check that out. It also has, if you go to dockerinmotion.com, it also has a website, and that website, dockerinmotion.com, is the website that we are currently pulling down off of that web server. So that is now finished, and it has succeeded. If I went to the code, and if in here I did Docker images, we will see that we have how to code well manning web server 01. Now, we're running this against the host machine that we created, the Jenkins, is it Jenkins Jenkins hyphen how to code well. That is the image, that is the Docker machine that we created. Because we're sharing the socket and because we're sharing the binary, we are basically altering and adjusting the host machine, the images and the Docker on the host machine. This is why you need to be super careful when you're doing this, because any command that you run in the build process can impact other containers. So you might want to look upon this as having separate machines per Docker slave, per Jenkins slave, if you wanted to set it up like that. But anyway, let's go back to the browser and start playing around with this stuff. So this is actually a PHP website. And if I go back to, where's the browser gone? Here we go. If we scroll back up to the top, go back to the project, and then configure it, scroll to the bottom again. What we could do is we could do a Docker, or let's just do, I need to do an and a slash Docker run. Let's do hyphen name, give it a name of test. We're going to do that is the thing, the image that we're running. And we're going to just run php-v. So that's just going to run that container, spin it up with the container name of test, and it's going to do php-v. So if I was to save that and then build it again, it should be very quick because it doesn't need to do the downloading, because we've stored all the Docker layers. So we've got PHP 7 running against a Ubuntu 16.04.1. So this is basically how you can run things through your Docker container, through your Jenkins build process against different Docker containers, which is pretty awesome. Now the problem comes when you want to, because Docker is supposed to be, you're supposed to tear it up and tear it down, right? Containers shouldn't exist for a long time. So if this was, for example, a testing process, then what you should really be doing is after your build, you should be tearing down the containers. You shouldn't be leaving any artifacts after the build, unless perhaps those artifacts were an analysis of that particular build. Perhaps it was documentation, code coverage reports, and that kind of thing. But really what we've got here is we have a container, and we need to tear that container down. So let's just go back to the code and I'll explain a little bit more as what I mean by that. If I did docker ps-a, we can see that we now have two containers. We have the manning web server, how to code well / manning web server 01. That was created about a minute ago and it has exited. And we now have, and of course we have our Jenkins container. Now if I was to run this again, it would freak out because we've used the name argument and we've called this test. It's going to freak out because there's a container already in existence called test. So if I go back to the browser, which is this button here, and that button there, I need to have one of those stream decks where I can just push buttons and things happen. Okay, if I go back to the project and attempt to build it again, sorry, click on that, there we go, build now, so the fifth build, it's going to fail, and it's going to fail because there is a name conflict. The name conflict of test is already in use by a container. Even though that container has exited, that container still exists, and we need to remove that container each time we run a build process. That's why I named it, because if you don't name your containers, then your container names are going to be completely random, which means that you will not have any control over that unless you did some fancy sort of bash scripting to work out what container was what and so forth and remove that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to the project and configure it. We're going to add another build step to tear that down, and we're going to tear it down after the build has succeeded. So we can do docker rm -f of test. So that will remove test, but we're in a position at the moment where we still have this container lurking about. We can't run a build until that container has actually been removed. So what we need to do is we need to work out whether there is a container that does exist and remove that. So just bear with me just a second whilst I just take a look at my notes, because I did actually write this down. And of course, if you try and remove a container that doesn't exist, you get an error. So you need to have some form of logic to work out whether that container is in existence, and if it does, remove it. If it doesn't exist, then leave it alone, because there's nothing to do with it. So just bear with me just a second whilst I have a look and find some code, because there is a bash script that I've got that will help solve this issue. It is where is it? Where did I put it? Where did that go? Give me just a few more minutes whilst I try and track this thing down. I was dealing with it just a few minutes ago a few minutes before the stream. So, and I've gone and for the life of me forgotten where I've put it. Bear with me just a second. Let's just go back into here and take a look at. Aha, this could be it. I should have done this. Yeah. Oh, it's going to be an XML, isn't it? Oh, bugger. Bugger. Okay, bear with me just a second. Yikes. Yikes. Config.xml. Here we go. There we go. Let's copy that. Okay, I will explain in just a second as to what on earth I'm doing, but just to show you something, let's go back to here. Let's go back to the code just to show you what I was doing. There is a previous build that I've done for another Jenkins build that I've done before, and I was trying to work out where to get the old previous commands from, and I found them in Jenkins Home in jobs. This one is called test and builds. If you click on one of these builds, so these builds relate to the builds that we've got on the Jenkins dashboard, and of course you've got last failed, last stable, last success, and so forth. If you click on one of these, let's go for number 4. If you click on build.xml, you have an XML output of the build, and you also have, so you have like where it lives and all of this stuff. And if you did, was it one of these things? I can't find it at the moment. Oh yeah, config.xml. Scroll down, you can actually see the commands that we're running. So that's what I did. I actually went into the Jenkins directory and pulled out one of the commands. And the command that I'm going to be playing with is, if I go back to the browser, is a new command, and that command, so add a build step, execute the shell, is this bad boy. And this, I'm going to have to deal with these ands and stuff. Great. So that's a quote and a quote. So this is test. So Docker PS, that should be -a. So we are going to do that as a quote, like so. That's the quote. And app and pause. Yeah, I think that works fine. So that needs to be an and. Whoops. And that needs to be a quote. And so does this. And quat is quote. And quat. And quat. They might be they might be double quotes, unfortunately, which means that it might break. This is an and. But essentially what this does is it checks whether there is a container running, and if called test, and if it does, if it is running, then it will, that's a greater than symbol, it will remove it if it does exist, and if it doesn't exist, then it won't do anything, because the if statement will just continue. What is that? And pos. Never seen that one before. Let's just grab that. Oh, it's an escaped, of course. It's an apostrophe, I think. Right. Okay. I guess what I could do for this example, because I don't think this is going to work, to be fair, is I could let's just remove this step, add another one, and just do docker stop test, and then docker rm -f test, and put this right at the top. Which is this one here, up here. There we go. So we're stopping test, and then we're removing test. Then we're pulling it down, and then we're running it. And then after that, we're getting the version of PHP, and then we're removing it. Just gonna check a couple of things first before I do that. There's all sorts of ways you could do this, of course. That was actually quite a complicated bash script. We could use just finding the various names and stuff. Yeah, so we could do that. That's not a problem. Or we could use the filter. I'm just having a look at some documentation here. Or we could use the filter to filter that out, which is fine. We could get the ID and remove that too. Yep. Some people are suggesting to run the inspect command with a filter, which, yeah, you could do that. Yeah, I mean, it depends if you want error messages or not, and we kind of really don't need it. Well, we shouldn't have error messages. So I guess going back to the original thing, I do apologize for jumping up and jumping around about this, is that we could just run check check the container. It's a bit of a mouthful, but let's just run this and see. Sorry, let's have a look. Where am I now? Still on the shell. Okay, let's go back to here. Remove that window. So we can't do that. I'll explain why. We can't run this because this is going to stop the container and then remove the container. But it doesn't actually check whether that container actually exists. So this will throw an error, and if it throws an error, it will have an exit code, which means that the next command, the next shell build command, won't run. So this is why you need to put in these kind of rule sets. What we could do is something like this, which again is a bit of a mouthful. I do appreciate that. Essentially what we're doing is we're giving the container name, which is app. I got this from Stack Overflow, by the way. And we do a docker ps-a to list all of the containers, regardless of whether they're running or not. Then we pipe that into an awk script, and that basically checks whether or not it's up and running, and if it comes back with anything. And then it does a docker stop against that container, and then it does a remove. rm-f is remove of that container. So if I was to save and apply that, let's hit build again. What it should do is, if I go to console output, the first thing it should do is the first command, which removes the container test because the container did exist, so it's ran that. The next thing it does is the docker pull command, because we're pulling down that image from manning web server -01. Because we've already pulled that, there's no changes. There's no changes to the Docker layers, so it's not actually installing anything. It's using the latest tag, and again, we could be automating this. So, for example, if you had an image per deployment, per build, then you could be pulling that. That could be passed in as a variable, perhaps. And then after that, it's running the php-v command against the container. So we're running that container with the name of test. And then after that, it's removing that container, which means that we now have a complete end-to-end process. The container gets built from the image that gets pulled down, and then it gets removed. But before any of that happens, it checks whether that container is in existence and then removes it. So, for example, if I go back to the code and did docker ps-a, this is where I was getting it from, -a, we can see that we only have one container here, which is the Jenkins thing. So let's build that again, and I'll just show you what that does as an end-to-end. So let's go back to the project, and then let's build it again. Okay, so again, it hasn't found the container because we removed it previously. And therefore it hasn't ran that rm command because that was in the if statement in the bash script. Next command it runs is the pull command. It already has the latest from the digest. That's fine. So status image is up to date. So if I was to go ahead and change the latest tag, it would pull it down. And then we do the php-v to get the version of PHP. Then we remove the container. And again, if I go back to the code, I can now do, I can now do docker ps-a, and it's clean. So it's a very sort of isolated build process. But that's basically it. That is basically, well, I shouldn't say basically because it isn't basic. That is a streamed down version of how you can use Docker in Jenkins. But yeah, I'm going to leave it there because I've been going on for about an hour and a half now. So I do appreciate your time. I'll just go back and show you what the Docker file actually looks like. So we're actually installing Docker, and we are setting Jenkins to have the user access to the Docker group. And of course, in the Docker compose file, we're also supplying the host socket and the binary as well. So you have to be careful. If your host changes, then you got to be careful with that. But anyway, thank you ever so much for watching. Happy coding, and if I don't speak to you beforehand, have a very Merry Christmas and a happy New Year. And we will see you soon. Thank you ever so much for watching. Cheers. Bye.